What is the true origin of ancient Egypt? Welcome to Collapse, where history comes alive and where each video plunges you into the destinies of those who shaped the world. Today, get ready to cross the veil of time and journey back to the legendary banks of the Nile, where the sands witnessed the birth of one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known. Between the chaos of origins and the divine order of the pharaoh, Egypt is invented, stone by stone, offering by offering, to become the land of the living. For millennia, its temples still whisper. But what truly hides behind the birth of this immortal civilization? But before embarking on a new adventure, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to not miss anything. Thank you, and have a great journey. Before observing the birth of the pharaonic state in Egypt, it is essential to place the Nile Valley in a broader global context, between around 6,000 and 3,200. At this time, many cultures flourish around the world. Agricultural innovations, the first urban states, and interregional trade networks are just beginning to take shape. In this narrative, we will cover the main regions shaping the world of the time, paying attention to global climatic factors and emerging trade routes. This will help to understand why the Nile Valley will gradually become such a unique and strategic space for pre-dynastic populations and then for the pharaonic future. Between 6,000 and 3,200, the region commonly known as the Fertile Crescent extends from the Mediterranean Sea to the Persian Gulf, encompassing Mesopotamia, the current territories of Iraq and Syria, part of the Levant, including Lebanon, Israel, and Palestine, and the upper valley of the Tigris and Euphrates. This area, endowed with alluvial lands and a relatively favorable climate, will see the rise of sedentary societies surpassing the mere village stage to transform into city-states. The two most emblematic Sumerian cities, Uruk and Ur, gradually emerge in southern Mesopotamia. Uruk, around 4,000, stands out for its nascent monumentality. Large temples, called ziggurats, are erected there, built of mud bricks. The first signs of a centralized administration appear in the form of clay tablets, engraved with pre-cuneiform signs, ancestors of the future cuneiform writing. This early form of proto-writing responds to the needs of accounting and stock management, notably for barley, oil, and livestock. Irrigation, made possible by the proximity of rivers, proves crucial for agriculture, as the arid climate and irregular floods require collective organization. Canals and dikes multiply, overseen by a religious and political elite. In this context, the population gradually specializes, consisting of farmers, artisans, priests, and local leaders. Skilled workers craft various objects, notably ceramic or metal containers, thanks to the early introduction of copper. The wealth of agricultural surpluses allows for the exchange and circulation of precious objects, a phenomenon not then limited to Mesopotamia alone, but already extending beyond, towards the Nile Valley and the distant lands of Asia. Further north of Mesopotamia, Anatolia in present-day Turkey, and, to the east, the heights of the Iranian plateau also host pioneering communities. Satal Hoyuk, occupied from around 7,000, remains one of the most famous Neolithic sites. At the time of our interest, between 6,000 and 3,200, the region sees different archaeological cultures coexisting. Among them, the Holaf culture around 6,000 extends to the north of Mesopotamia and is characterized by fine, polychrome pottery. Then the Ubaid culture, further south in Mesopotamia, will gradually extend northward, heralding the transition to the Uruk period, marked by rapid urbanization. Over the millennia, obsidian, a black and glassy volcanic rock, has held major importance. Extracted notably in the Anatolian highlands, it was used to make extremely sharp blades and arrowheads, highly valued for hunting or working with skins. Its circulation over long distances demonstrates a well-structured trade network connecting Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and sometimes other regions of the Near East. At the same time, copper was increasingly discovered and exploited, which, when cold-hammered or heated, allowed the manufacture of points, jewelry, and various tools. Although the Bronze Age had not yet begun, these early metallurgies marked a gradual revolution in production techniques. Furthermore, the Iranian plateaus, rich in deposits, served as a reservoir of mineral resources. Copper was found there, but also lead and sometimes silver. The populations, although still rural and scattered, laid the foundations for future regional political entities through the organization of extraction, circulation, and processing of minerals. Thousands of kilometers from Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, located in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, became home to one of the earliest centers of settlement and agriculture known. The village of Mehrgarh, established as early as 7000 before Christ E, is often cited as one of the major early Neolithic sites in the region. It was there that, among other things, the domestication of certain varieties of wheat and barley, as well as cattle breeding, developed. The mention of wild rye or early wheat reminds us that cultivated varieties resulted from a long process of selection from wild plants adapted to the surrounding plains and foothills. From around 6000 to 3200 before Christ, the culture of Mehrgarh evolved. It adopted increasingly elaborate pottery techniques, embellished with geometric or zoomorphic motifs. The trade routes connecting this region to the Iranian plateaus were crucial for the exchange of raw materials, such as lapis lazuli or certain semi-precious stones. Early forms of specialization appeared as some inhabitants dedicated themselves to making jewelry. Others worked with ceramics, while farmers grew cereals on the alluvial soils. A religious influence can be glimpsed in small terracotta figurines, representing either human forms or sacred animals. Already, the Indus Valley, benefiting from a network of rivers fed by the melting snows of the Himalayas, was transforming into a civilization laboratory. Gradually, communities acquired the ability to manage their hydraulic resources, a determining factor for the future of the Indus culture, which, a few centuries later, would flourish in the form of well-organized cities like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. While Asia was witnessing the birth of the first cities, Europe at the end of the Neolithic period was also experiencing significant upheavals. In the north and west of the continent, particularly along the Atlantic coast, mysterious stone monuments like megaliths were erected. The alignments of menhirs, these standing stones, dolmens, which are burial chambers, and cairns, stone tumuli, bear witness to the emergence of collective beliefs and funerary practices. Although the symbolic meaning of these megaliths is still debated, their scale implies a social organization capable of mobilizing labor and resources over long periods. Further east, the Baltic Sea became a center for the extraction and trade of amber, a precious fossil resin prized for its golden color and magical religious virtues. Amber beads and amulets are found in burials from the same period, sometimes far from their source of origin, indicating a wide exchange network. Agro-pastoral populations gradually settled, cultivating cereals and legumes, and raising domesticated animals such as cattle and pigs. The development of pottery allowed for the storage of foodstuffs and facilitated food preparation. In the more central parts of the continent, cultures such as the linear pottery culture from the 6th millennium before Christ gave way to varied regional entities. European Neolithic culture, in the broad sense, is characterized by a gradual adoption of agriculture, originating from the Near East. Exchanges, though less structured than in Mesopotamia or the Fertile Crescent, nevertheless help disseminate techniques and innovations. It is in this cultural crucible that the foundations of a post-Neolithic Europe are formed, ready to welcome new metallurgical and economic influences in turn. During this same period, sub-Saharan Africa experiences significant climatic and cultural changes. The Sahara, which was a bit more humid before 6000 before Christ, gradually dries up, transforming once fertile areas into inhospitable deserts. Previously, in the north of the continent, there was the Green Sahara, an ecosystem where lakes, temporary rivers, and pastures allowed flora and fauna to thrive. The remnants of Saharan rock art bear witness to a vibrant life. We often see representations of cattle herds, ostriches, and even crocodiles, indicating the presence of water and once abundant pastures. As the climate becomes more arid, Sahelian herders are forced to migrate. They typically follow the remaining humidity, moving south or east in search of more reliable pastures. Some move closer to the Nile Valley, taking advantage of the reliable presence of a river fed by Ethiopian rains. In sub-Saharan regions, pastoralism thus gains in importance. Primarily cattle are raised, but also goats and sheep. The nomadic men and women develop networks of trade in salt, skins, and handcrafted items. They establish occasional contacts with other sedentary communities further north and, in doing so, participate in the cultural evolution that affects the whole of North Africa. This phenomenon of desertification, which began around 5500 before Christ and intensified until about 3000 before Christ, partly explains why some populations will settle permanently on the banks of the Nile. There, water is guaranteed, creating conditions conducive to sedentarism, agro-pastoralism, and later, the emergence of a unique civilization. In the Mediterranean basin, in the center of the sea, various Neolithic cultures develop slow links between Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. Among them, the so-called cardial culture, named after the cardium shells used to decorate pottery, develops from the 6th millennium before Christ E and spreads along the coasts of the Western Mediterranean. This culture, although earlier in its appearance, continues in various forms to influence the period we speak of, until around 3200 before Christ E. Cardial pottery is noted for shell imprints on the pottery, creating wavy or geometric patterns. Meanwhile, the central Mediterranean islands such as Lipari off Sicily, Malta, and Crete play an important role in the circulation of obsidian. As in Anatolia, this volcanic rock is highly sought after for making cutting tools. Obsidian from Lipari has been found on the Italian mainland and sometimes in distant sites. These maritime exchanges indicate that prehistoric navigators already followed regular coastal routes, ensuring a form of small-scale commerce. The expansion of agriculture and livestock, facilitated by these transmarine interactions, contributes to the prosperity of island communities, which also develop complex funeral rites. The countless megalithic structures on Malta, mostly later, probably have roots in this shared Neolithic culture. Despite the absence of state centralization comparable to Mesopotamia, the central Mediterranean proves to be a dynamic crossroads where resources, ideas, and techniques are exchanged, which then converge towards the Levant or Egypt. On a planetary scale, the post-glacial period witnesses the establishment of more temperate and stable climatic conditions, often referred to as the Holocene climatic optimum. This optimum roughly covers the period from 8,000 to 4,000, but its effects can extend to 3,000 in some regions. The warming temperatures and relative increase in precipitation in several areas favor the expansion of agriculture and settlement. The glaciers, melting since the end of the last ice age, contribute to a slow but noticeable rise in sea levels. In the Red Sea region, this gradual rise impacts the coastal shores, slightly reshaping the coastlines. For the coastal populations, this means adapting to variations in salinity and the gradual reduction of exploitable coastal plains. These climatic factors are not uniform, with some regions benefiting from additional rains, while others experience episodes of aridification. Human communities must therefore demonstrate flexibility. In the Fertile Crescent, as we have seen, irrigation develops notably to compensate for annual variations in river flows. Each population reacts according to its immediate environment. This may involve cultivating more resistant varieties, managing water resources, building dikes, or fleeing excessively flooded areas. Despite these challenges, the Holocene optimum remains a generally favorable period for agricultural advancement and population growth. The abundance of resources often fosters not only survival, but also diversification of cultural, artisanal, and social activities. As some regions benefit from this Holocene optimum, others, like the Sahara, experience a gradual shift toward drier conditions. This Saharan aridification, which spreads over several millennia, is a determining factor for the reconfiguration of populations and territories. Between 5,500 and 3,000, the grassy plains and shallow lakes shrink, the vegetation cover diminishes, and herds are forced to migrate. The Sahelian herders, who depend on seasonal pastures, find that water and vegetation become scarce. Several groups then move to more hospitable places, notably along the Nile, whose flow remains relatively stable thanks to Ethiopian rains. This migration to the Nile Valley has notable consequences. On one hand, it enriches the human and cultural diversity of the region, then still sparsely populated. On the other hand, it introduces or strengthens cattle breeding and other pastoral practices in the valley, where agriculture is already present in embryonic form. Encounters and potential tensions between nomadic herders and sedentary farmers are sometimes resolved through mutual exchanges of techniques and goods. This convergence fosters the establishment of more complex communities capable of exploiting river resources and livestock. Later, at the turn of the 4th millennium, these mixed populations contribute to shaping the cultural identity of the Nile Basin, then ready to give rise to local proto-chiefdoms that will lay the foundations of the pharaonic unification. As the societies in these different regions structure themselves, long-distance exchanges gradually emerge. The discovery of lapis lazuli, a deep blue stone originating especially from the Badakhshan Mountains in present-day Afghanistan, in Mesopotamian sites, attests already, around 4000 or earlier, to an extensive trading network. This route, which can take land and river paths, crosses high-altitude passes and traverses the Iranian plateau, putting various communities in contact. Similarly, turquoise extracted from the Sinai Peninsula in northeastern Egypt also circulates towards the Nile Valley, where it is highly valued for making amulets and symbolic objects. Local populations in exchange can offer grains or other agricultural products. Of course, these routes are not as organized as the future great caravan routes of antiquity, but they already reveal an enthusiasm for rare and exotic products. Precious materials are transported by small groups of merchants, caravanners, and sometimes nomadic intermediaries. Furthermore, these exchanges are not limited to stones or metals. Pottery techniques, artistic styles, decorative motifs, and sometimes even religious ideas spread through these nascent networks. These early contacts between distant regions laid the groundwork for a future proto-historic globalization rich in cultural transfers. At the dawn of the third millennium, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, Anatolia, and the Nile are already partially interconnected by these routes, promoting the emergence of more complex civilizations. Alongside the land routes, the Red Sea region also plays a significant role in interregional exchanges. The populations living on its shores, east of the Nile Valley and west of the Arabian Peninsula, are developing coastal navigation skills. Although we do not have written documents from this era to attest to it, archaeology suggests that coastal trading allows for linking, by sea, certain remote areas of East Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. Navigators transport incense, probably derived from the Boswellia sacra tree, resins burned during religious rituals, ebony, whose intense black color is prized for sculpture, and sometimes even exotic animals such as baboons or felines. The legendary land of Punt, mentioned later in pharaonic inscriptions, is probably a region located along the Red Sea, or even further south in the Horn of Africa. Many clues suggest that informal contacts already exist during the pre-dynastic period. Traces of aromatic substances, the appearance of certain animal species, or decorative motifs hinting at African influence reinforce the idea that this maritime trade did not emerge ex nihilo during the pharaonic era. These navigations, even modest ones, cultivate the curiosity of societies in search of rare and precious products. They also nurture a collective imagination where the distant, the exotic, and the mysterious exert considerable attraction. Virgin or sophisticated maritime adventure on the Red Sea gradually shapes Egypt's status as a point of contact between Africa and Asia, foreshadowing a major diplomatic role that will flourish in the centuries to come. For millennia, the Nile has shaped the life and culture of those who have settled along its banks. Before the formation of a unified pharaonic state, the Nile Valley was already a space conducive to the flourishing of complex societies. In the heart of a desert area, this majestic river provided precious water resources, essential for agriculture and the subsistence of populations. But the Nile was not only a vein of prosperity, it also served as a natural route allowing commercial and cultural exchanges from one region to another. The landscapes of the valley offered, moreover, unique ecological conditions that encouraged the introduction of technological innovations, the rise of emerging religious practices, and the emergence of interaction networks between different communities. The main asset that characterizes the Nile Valley, even before the political unification of Egypt, lies in the annual cycle of floods. Each year, during the season of Etched, the waters of the river rise significantly, carrying black silt, rich in nutrients that fertilize the surrounding lands. Once the flood is over, the season of Pare sees the gradual retreat of the waters, paving the way for sowing on the newly enriched soils. Finally, the period of Shemu corresponds to the harvest when the crops have matured and can be collected. This natural calendar offered an almost miraculous framework for agriculture, allowing local communities to benefit from exceptional productivity compared to other regions of the world where access to water and fertility was much more uncertain. Beyond the vital contribution of the river, the Nile Valley benefited from relative isolation, thanks to several natural barriers that protected its inhabitants from frequent invasions. To the west lay the Libyan desert, characterized by dunes and an arid climate, making it difficult for large herds or armies to pass through. To the east, the Arabian desert presented steep mountains and vast rocky plains, also discouraging hostile incursions. To the south, the Nubian cataracts formed natural rapids that were difficult to cross, while to the north, the largely marshy Nile Delta served as a protective and complex barrier for anyone attempting to bypass these obstacles. Thanks to this geographical environment, the Nilotic communities were able to develop with a relative sense of security and stabilize their social structures. Before the advent of centralized political structures, several Neolithic cultures flourished along the Nile Valley. One of the oldest identified by archaeologists is the so-called Fayum A culture, located in the Karun Lake region, west of the Nile, dated from around 5,000 to 4,000 dollars. Before Christi, it is characterized by the presence of circular silos where grains, particularly barley and wheat, were stored. The inhabitants of Fayum A also used serrated sickles made of flint, demonstrating agricultural technology adapted for harvesting. Moreover, the Fayum A culture left traces of early woven papyrus items, suggesting that this aquatic plant was not only used for practical purposes, but was beginning to serve as a basis for diversified craftsmanship. A little further north, in the Delta region, the Merimde culture and, later on, the Omari culture both demonstrated notable technical achievements. At Merimde, dated from around 4800 to 4300 before Christ, semi-underground dwellings and terracotta female figurines were found, indicating an early interest in human representation and potentially spiritual dimensions. The first signs of a form of proto-hydraulics also appeared in these communities, where rudimentary canals were developed to control the water from the Nile. As for the Omari culture, located not far from Cairo, it is distinguished by the production of finer ceramics and progressively more sophisticated grain grinding techniques. This shows a continuous progression towards the organization of village life. The El Badari culture, approximately 4400 to 4000 before Christ, played a major role in the incubation of pre-dynastic Egyptian civilization. Renowned for its polished red pottery, it reveals notable artisanal finesse. There are also the first pit graves, where the deceased was sometimes accompanied by a makeup palette, a sign of aesthetic and ritual concern. These objects could symbolize an interest in life after death. Badarian practices demonstrate a society already well-structured, attentive to the production of refined goods and the flourishing of funerary beliefs. They form an essential milestone for understanding the formation of emerging local elites. Beyond local specificities, the inhabitants of the Nile Valley made significant advances in animal domestication and technical innovations. Among the animals raised, the humped cattle and Nubian donkey were quickly adopted, facilitating the transportation of goods over long distances. In parallel, the cultivation of flax thrived for the production of fine textiles, while papyrus fibers were used to create ropes and crafted objects. Importantly, barley allowed for the development of beer, a fermented beverage central both in daily life and during funerary banquets. Through this, beer reinforced social cohesion and expressed a spiritual connection with the Nile. This set of practices illustrates the innovative capacity of these early societies, paving the way for later advances. These funerary banquets went beyond the simple scope of culinary celebration. According to the remnants, they promoted social cohesion, perpetuated the memory of the deceased, and integrated them into a broader cosmic order. Offerings of grains, beer, or meat emphasized agricultural prosperity, closely linked to the floods of the Nile. Such rites exalted the river as a quasi-sacred entity, guaranteeing collective survival. The first indications of graves accompanied by personal items already suggest the belief in an afterlife, where the deceased maintained a form of existence. This spiritual aspect foreshadows the future religious developments of the pharaonic world, where death becomes a passage towards a symbolic and cosmic rebirth. This transition already outlines an eternal connection with the natural cycle. Between 6000 and 3200 before Christ, these communities evolved progressively, constantly seeking to adapt to environmental fluctuations and the opportunities offered by the Nile. Agricultural developments, social organization around funerary spaces, and the establishment of rudimentary hydraulic infrastructures already testify to an advanced understanding of the available natural resources. While some regions of the globe were still in stages of hunting and gathering, the inhabitants of the Nile Valley were already perfecting their techniques of cultivation and animal domestication. This slow but steady accumulation of know-how laid the foundations for future larger political groupings, eventually leading to unification under a central power. In this perspective, one can see how these early evolutions would pave the way for the still distant state structures. The local dry and desert climate played a decisive role in the preservation of these Neolithic cultures. Unlike other geographical areas marked by humidity, organic materials like wood, textiles, or even certain plant remains could survive for millennia, providing archaeologists with a detailed insight into the daily life of these populations. The grains found in the silos of the Fayum, for example, have been studied to determine their variety and better understand the local diet. Similarly, objects made from papyrus fibers, sometimes extremely fragile, have remained in good condition, allowing the ingenuity of these pre-dynastic peoples to be measured. This abundance of material proof contributes to painting a more complete picture of the civilizational journey in the Nile Valley. Despite their different regional roots, it is clear that the cultures of Fayum, Merimde, Omari, and El Badari were not completely isolated from each other. Exchanges of tools, ceramics, and even ideas circulated along the Nile, facilitated by the waterway provided by this river. Agricultural techniques could thus spread rapidly, as could certain cultural practices, such as funerary rites or the artistic representation of figurines. This mixing contributed to the emergence of a shared Nilotic identity, where one could still find a diversity of regional styles. Some archaeological sites exhibit pottery, typical of several contemporary cultures, offering proof that these populations indeed communicated, exchanging know-how and prestige goods. This interaction laid the groundwork for future unification, as it created a common foundation of experiences. In the more concrete field of technology, these different Neolithic cultures perfected the use of chipped stone, serving both for the crafting of agricultural tools and the sculpture of ritual objects. The flints found in the Nile Valley were then shaped into points, blades, and scrapers, meeting the varied needs of daily life. We also observe a progressive improvement in polishing techniques, allowing the production of more precise and durable tools. Polished axes, for example, proved very useful for clearing new agricultural lands or for cutting wood to build dwellings. Such technical progress illustrates the adaptability and innovation demonstrated by these pre-dynastic populations, further consolidating their hold on the Nilotic environment while strengthening their self-sufficiency. From an agronomic perspective, the Nile Valley was a true laboratory of domestication for cereal plants, mainly barley and different varieties of wheat, such as emmer and einkorn. These cereals, benefiting from the natural hydration left by the annual flood, constituted the basis of the local diet. Beans, lentils, and peas were also part of the diet of these populations, thus complementing the animal protein intake obtained through livestock farming. Archaeobotanical evidence reveals a growing understanding of each plant's growth cycles and a concern for producing enough to build stocks in anticipation of shortages. This food security encouraged local communities to perfect their storage and preservation techniques, as evidenced by the circular silos in Fayum A or the organized granaries in Merimde. The resulting agricultural surplus brought about profound transformations in social organization. When food became abundant, not all community members needed to devote themselves exclusively to food production. Thus, a form of labor specialization could emerge, where some individuals dedicated themselves to pottery, basketry, or even nascent metallurgy. The first blacksmiths explored, albeit in a limited way, the available copper deposits in desert areas, foreshadowing future advances in metalworking. Furthermore, the emergence of specialized roles probably encouraged an embryonic social hierarchy, with communal leaders or elders responsible for managing the surplus, organizing collective projects, and maintaining internal cohesion essential to the group's proper functioning. On the spiritual plane, the accumulation of wealth and the more complex organization of society fostered the emergence of more elaborate beliefs. Although elements of mythology remain difficult to identify in these pre-dynastic cultures, funerary objects, figurines, and arranged tombs suggest the existence of a worldview where death did not signify the ultimate end. The makeup palettes discovered in El Badari, for example, might have had a ritual use in addition to their daily function, associating bodily beauty with a form of spiritual purification. Moreover, the Nile itself seemed to play an almost divine role, being the source of abundance and the guarantor of survival. These religious foundations would be further structured as political centralization progressed. The Neolithic period in the Nile Valley also coincides with global climatic changes affecting the availability of arable lands. The Holocene experienced a climatic optimum conducive to the expansion of agricultural practices. While the Sahara was drying up, herders migrated to the valley, increasing cultural diversity and the exchange of knowledge. This influx exerted pressure on resources, but also brought new skills in livestock farming and tooling. Thus, the Nile became a convergence point for heterogeneous groups, stimulating mutual enrichment. Various skills spread there, whether it be techniques of domestication, irrigation, or soil exploitation. This adaptation to climatic uncertainties strengthened prior cohesion, paving the way for the emergence of unified political entities. This phenomenon marks a crucial milestone toward the brilliant pharaonic civilizations to come. Grouped under the name of the Naqada pre-dynastic cultures, which span approximately from 4000 to 3150, three successive phases retrace the slow evolution of Egyptian society before the emergence of a centralized royal power. The first of these stages, called Naqada Tafins or Amratian, after the site of El Amra in Upper Egypt, generally extends from 4000 to 3500. At the heart of this phase, we observe economic, social, and cultural transformations that already testify to an emerging identity along the Nile Valley. The name Naqada originates from the eponymous archaeological site located near the western bank of the Nile, in Upper Egypt. It was there, at the end of the 19th century, that researchers unearthed remains indicating a specific pre-dynastic culture, distinct from other contemporary groups by its pottery, funerary practices, and the shape of certain tools. Subsequent excavations confirmed that Naqada was not an isolated phenomenon, but rather the manifestation of a society in full transformation, already in contact with various regions of the valley and beyond. The Amratian phase is marked by the rise of ceramic art, with the production of characteristic two-tone pottery. Their upper part often takes on a reddish hue, while the base and interior remain lighter. On their surfaces, painted decorations evoke the importance of river navigation. Rowboats, a major symbol of mobility on the Nile, are frequently depicted. Animal silhouettes, such as hippopotamuses, birds, and cows, sometimes schematic, and stylized human representations, complete this Nilotic imagery. The clay, carefully prepared and fired at relatively high temperatures, provides the vessels with remarkable solidity for the time. In some Amratian tombs, these potteries are found as funerary offerings, suggesting that the deceased was to benefit from subsistence goods or symbolic objects for the afterlife. Sometimes, these graves include rudimentary toilet pallets, small polished stone plaques used to prepare pigments for makeup. These early pallets, still little adorned, initiate a tradition that will grow in later periods, where they will become true artistic supports. In this context, social differentiation seems to be accentuating. Some individuals, probably village chiefs or notables, are buried with more prestigious goods, signs of superior status. The economy then largely relies on agriculture with cereals and vegetables, fishing in the Nile, goat and cattle breeding, as well as hunting in the nearby desert areas. The annual floods of the river enrich the soils with silt, allowing for regular harvests. At the same time, still modest exchanges are established between the communities of Upper Egypt, particularly for the circulation of pottery, flint tools, and complementary resources. Although the extent of these contacts remains more limited than in Naqada II, the relational network already extends beyond simple village groupings. Little is still known about the religious system of Naqada I, but the attention given to burials indicates a certain respect for the deceased, perhaps linked to belief in post-mortem survival. Bodies, often placed in simple oval pits, were sometimes wrapped in mats woven with plant materials. Some graves contain more goods than others, which could illustrate the beginnings of an internal hierarchy within the community. All these clues, decorated pottery, pallets, differentiated tombs, allow us to gauge the progressive rise of a unified culture along the Nile. Around 3500 before Christ, the face of the Nile Valley transforms and marks the entrance into the second phase known as Naqada II, or Gerzean after the Giza cemetery. Material, artistic, and social evolutions become more tangible. Craftsmanship refines, commercial exchanges multiply, and the political structure seems to gain in complexity. Thus, the appearance of new prestige objects, such as zoomorphic cosmetic palettes, is noted. Carved from schist, or a greenish stone called grey wake, they often take the form of animals, like fish, turtles, or bovine heads, engraved with particular care. Beyond their practical role for grinding pigments, these palettes display an ostentatious status, reflecting the emergence of elites eager to exhibit their wealth. Another major indicator of nascent centralization is the proliferation of falcon engravings, likely associated with an early royal deity, prefiguring the god Horus. These representations are found particularly on seals or ivory tags, but also on decorative knife handles. The falcon then becomes a symbol of sovereignty, suggesting the existence at this time of powerful chiefs whose authority could extend over several Upper Egyptian sites. Royal attributes, though rudimentary, thus begin to formalize. We are still in the pre-dynastic phase, but already an embryonic royalty is asserting itself. Naqada Seku. Pottery is also distinguished by richer iconography than in the past. Some vessels feature narrative scenes with people, plants, and animals from the Nile. Sometimes there are representations of battles or processions, demonstrating an increasing interest in staging collective life. The manufacturing technique progresses with better quality clays, controlled firing, and more precise decoration. Gradually, these ceramic styles spread beyond Upper Egypt, hinting at an increasingly dense network of interregional exchanges each year. Economically, Naqada II is characterized by a diversification of commercial contacts. It is known that the Egyptians maintained relations with the city of Byblos on the Levantine coast in present-day Lebanon to import cedar, a wood variety highly valued for building superior quality boats and structures. At the same time, expeditions headed south to Nubia, where gold could be obtained. This precious metal would become one of the major criteria of social distinction in the tombs of the elite. Caravans, whether on land or river, thus ensured a flow of raw materials to the Nile Valley, consolidating the position of leaders, capable of managing and then redistributing these resources. The circulation of ivory, incense, and semi-precious stones, although still limited, reinforces the hierarchical structure of society by creating new luxury items. Gold ornaments, sometimes set with pearls or inlays, begin to appear, albeit sporadically. At the same time, the technique of engraving on bone or stone is refined, suggesting more specialized practices within local craftsmanship. This artistic refinement reflects a need to codify prestige, to manifest a form of symbolic power through remarkable objects. Social changes are also expressed in funerary practices. Naqada II tombs often prove to be more spacious, with increased funerary furnishings. Bodies rest in pits, sometimes reinforced with wooden planks or mud bricks. Some burials show a concern for the arrangement of offerings. Jars, pallets, and jewelry are carefully placed around the deceased. Here again, these witnesses confirm the rise of individuals capable of monopolizing prestige goods, which implies a form of authority supported by a more rigorous organization. The relative homogeneity of these burial practices from the Abydos region to Hierakonpolis suggests a culture already unified in its broad outlines. Naqada II thus sees the consolidation of what will become the foundation of the pharaonic state, with symbols of sovereignty like the falcon and zoomorphic palettes, high-quality craftsmanship, more extensive trade networks, and heightened social stratification. However, it is not until the next phase, Naqada III, that these elements decisively converge towards the near completion of a centralized royal power. With the Naqada III period, often called the Samanian after the Samani site, or Dynasty 0, a decisive stage begins approximately between 3200 and 3150. This phase shortly precedes the traditional unification attributed to King Narmer, considered the founder of the first dynasty. Archaeological evidence points to a qualitative leap in political organization with the standardization of cylinder seals, the establishment of monumental funerary enclosures, and the emergence of royal iconography that clearly foreshadows that of the first historical dynasties. The cylinder seals of Naqada III, made from clay or stone, have sharper and more regular engraved motifs, reflecting a desire to distinguish the origin and destination of certain goods. Rolling the seal over damp clay allows for hermetically sealing jars or granary doors. Thus, if the seal is broken, fraudulent opening is evident. This practice illustrates the rise of a rudimentary bureaucracy, aiming to control the flow of goods like grains, oil, linen, and precious metals. Centralization is therefore seen in the need to secure stocks and guarantee their redistribution. In the funerary context, Naqada III stands out for the construction of monumental enclosures, particularly visible at Abydos, a place destined to become one of the major religious and political centers of pharaonic Egypt. Built from mud bricks, these enclosures delimit sacred spaces dedicated either to the commemoration of a sovereign of Dynasty 0 or to ritual practices echoing the funerary cult. Their size and design suggest significant material resources, likely gathered through the authority of leaders capable of mobilizing a large workforce. This monumentality foreshadows the future great funerary constructions, such as mastabas, and later, pyramids. Among the key archaeological pieces from this period is the Scorpion King's palette, discovered in Hierakonpolis. On this schist plaque, the main figure, crowned with the white tiara of Upper Egypt, holds a tool akin to a hoe. He seems to be inaugurating or supervising the creation of a canal, an explicit symbol of his role as a hydraulic leader. The scorpion, engraved nearby, would be his emblem or name. This scene is fundamental to understanding the nascent ideology. The sovereign is the one who makes life possible by controlling water, thus providing fertility and prosperity to his people. This sacred dimension of the king, as guarantor of natural and social equilibrium, prefigures the doctrine of pharaonic kingship, where the pharaoh will be a mediator between cosmic forces and humans. In this same perspective of legitimizing power, the practice of the Serek establishes itself as a distinctive sign of the king. The Serek consists of a rectangle inside which the royal name is inscribed, topped by a falcon. This device precedes the use of the cartouche that will appear under the first historical dynasties. The presence of the falcon, the future Horus, reinforces the idea of divinity incarnated in the person of the sovereign. In terms of writing, Nakata III thus sees the consolidation of the beginnings of hieroglyphs. Some pictographic signs, still rudimentary, begin to be used to express an individual name or to denote content. The notions of property, identity, and power intertwine in an extremely innovative symbolic system. These developments are accompanied by greater territorial cohesion. Excavations suggest that several leaders, sometimes identified by animal emblems like the falcon, the scorpion, and the bull, compete to control various centers: Hierakonpolis, Nakata, Abydos. Each relies on local elites, whose support is manifested by the provision of resources, men, and a network of contacts. Successive conquests or alliances then weave the fabric of what will soon become a more formal political unification. Although the term Dynasty Zero does not appear in the official lists of kings found later, such as the Royal Canon of Turin or the Abydos Table, the sovereigns of this period decisively lay the foundations of pharaonic monarchy. This growing power largely rests on the ability to manage agriculture. The Nile's floods remain the primary source of collective subsistence, and the leader who ensures their regulation acquires a natural right to rule. Standardized cylinder seals, monumental funerary enclosures, and the innovation of the Serek are all markers of an emerging state. By the end of Nakata III, all essential institutions are in place. A nascent aristocracy, a royal cult that formalizes, solid commercial ties with neighboring regions, and the emergence of a form of writing linked to the expression of power. The exact role of each sovereign of what is called Dynasty Zero remains obscure, as discoveries are most often limited to fragments of labels, palettes, or tombs. However, names like Scorpion, or perhaps Ka and Hor, seem to indicate the existence of several kings, each ruling over a territory large and structured enough to leave coherent material testimonies. The use of recurring royal symbols and the desire to precisely identify authority through the Serek reflect a crucial step, that of the personalization of power, soon incarnated by a single unifying monarch. As we transition to the dynastic period, the growing coordination of resources and the strengthening of political ties already foreshadow the advent of a state governed from a single center. The rise of major sites like Abydos, where these great funerary enclosures are located, makes it a focal point of royal legitimacy. Hierakonpolis, from which the Scorpion King's palette originates, also demonstrates its importance as a religious and cultural center. Archaeology reveals that competition between these centers urges each sovereign to adopt a strong iconography, culminating in the emergence of Narmer, who eventually succeeds in imposing his authority over Lower Egypt. The unification of Egypt under King Narmer around 3150 before Christ remains one of the most significant founding moments in pharaonic history. For an international audience unfamiliar with this period, it is crucial to contextualize the symbolic conquest, the emergence of political mechanisms, and the role of state religion. This transition, marked by the appearance of the Narmer Palette and the founding of the capital at Memphis, constitutes a true turning point between pre-dynastic cultures and the birth of a unified kingdom. To fully understand the complexities of this episode, we will review the major elements that shaped this historical turning point: the symbolic conquest as it appears on the Narmer Palette, the establishment of a new territorial administration, and the increasing importance of a state religion, with the king becoming the living Horus. It is thus both a gradual evolution, rooted in pre-dynastic traditions, and a decisive political affirmation that seals the unity of the Nile Valley. The symbolic conquest lies at the very heart of the founding act, attributed to Narmer. At that time, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt were two distinct political and cultural entities, although already interconnected by the river and numerous trade exchanges. The Narmer Palette, discovered in the late 19th century at Hierakonpolis in Upper Egypt, is presented in the form of a slate plaque decorated on both sides with victory scenes. It explicitly illustrates the union of the two lands, known as Upper and Lower Egypt, and the takeover by a single sovereign. This object, measuring about 64 centimeters high, is today one of the most famous archaeological documents, allowing us to grasp the precise moment when the king becomes the living symbol of the entire country. On one side of the palette, Narmer is seen wearing the white crown, called hedjet, typical of Upper Egypt. He is depicted wielding a mace, a sign of his offensive power and his ability to subdue his enemies. In front of him, a kneeling enemy, ready to be struck, symbolizes the victory over the rival region or anyone who would threaten his authority. Behind him, a servant holds his sandals, indicating that the action takes place in a place considered sacred, where the king is sanctified by his office. On the other side, the sovereign now sports the red crown, or déchiré, characteristic of Lower Egypt. He inspects a triumphant procession, and a row of decapitated enemy corpses testifies to the domination he now exerts over the other part of the country. This juxtaposition of the two crowns, white and red, is one of the earliest clear archaeological testimonies of the political union of the two lands under a single monarch. On the lower register of the palette, a powerful bull, identified as the allegorical embodiment of the king, tramples an adversary and knocks down the walls of a fortified city. This particular scene carries significant importance because it expresses the bestial strength and total sovereignty of Narmer over a conquered territory. The bull is a dominant figure in Egyptian culture, symbolizing fertility and power. By associating this image with the king, the palette highlights the two crucial roles of the sovereign: dominator on the battlefield and guarantor of the perpetual renewal of the country. The use of the mace and the image of the bull here confirm the both military and religious dimension of the conquest. The Egyptians already perceived the king as a sacred individual, capable of ensuring the prosperity of the Nile Valley, notably through a fair control of the floods and the maintenance of the cosmic order. The representations on the palette are as many visual manifestations of a royal ideology that will develop and become more complex in the following centuries. This symbolic conquest is therefore not just a mere military victory. It seals a new pact between the sovereign and his subjects. By depicting scenes of triumph, the palette legitimizes Narmer's power and invites the population to recognize in him the living embodiment of a universal order, mastering the forces of chaos to impose harmony. By unifying the two entities of Upper and Lower Egypt with such striking representations, Narmer ensures that the entire population associates his reign with a new era of stability. Although it is very likely that the military conquest or political absorption were gradual, the narrative force of the Narmer palette allows for the immortalization of a founding act. For posterity, Narmer becomes the initiator of the double crowning and the first to have established rule over the complete extent of the Nile territory. Thus, the central aspect of this symbolic conquest endures in the collective memory, anchored in the rituals and pharaonic protocol that will follow. The choice to establish the capital in Memphis is first explained by a geographical and commercial logic. Located not far from the tip of the delta, where Upper Egypt ends and Lower Egypt begins, Memphis occupies an ideal median position. This site, often identified as the area of the White Wall in ancient texts, is situated on the western bank of the Nile, close to the main river branches that feed the delta. It thus benefits from a strategic commercial crossroads, allowing for control over both the traffic heading north towards the Mediterranean and the navigation heading south towards the oases and Nubia. In an environment where exchanges mostly occur by river and land routes, regulating the flow of goods equated to ensuring a form of economic supremacy. Caravans coming from eastern regions cross the delta to reach the highlands of Asia Minor or the African interior. Exotic products, wood, spices, metals, precious stones, thus transited through the valley, reinforcing the dominant position of the sovereign installed in Memphis. The city also had fertile lands on its outskirts, ideal for agricultural exploitation. Finally, the limestone quarries in the vicinity ensured a valuable supply for future monumental constructions. Furthermore, the installation of the royal palace and administrative apparatus in this location established new markers for local elites. While Upper Egypt retained its traditional centers, namely Nekhen, Abydos, and Nakada, Lower Egypt now bore the weight of a centralized power more closely administering agricultural production, population census, and military training. By establishing itself as the capital, Memphis paved the way for a new concept of pharaonic urbanism, notably a residence for the king, but also a logistical hub for collecting taxes and distributing rations to officials. Memphis thus became the seat of power where architects, scribes, sculptors, and various artisans were concentrated. This geographical concentration of skills and resources favored the artistic, political, and religious development of the nascent unified monarchy. Over time, the city was endowed with residential areas, sacred spaces reserved for cults, and temples intended to honor the king and the gods who protected his dynasty. Later, kings greatly benefited from this initial framework. In the shadow of the palace, the bureaucracy evolved, taxation was refined, and the sovereignty of the state materialized in the erection of increasingly imposing monuments. This new nerve center was not only a symbol of unification, but a strategic tool. Controlling the border between Upper and Lower Egypt required mastering this passage point. The delta, vast and marshy, harbored vital ports for maintaining trade with the Levant and the islands of the eastern Mediterranean. In contrast, Upper Egypt maintained its role as a corridor to African regions and to Nubian gold mines. The choice of Memphis, still in its infancy under Narmer, proved fundamental to the power and continuity of the Egyptian state. The unification under Narmer coincided with the emergence of new political mechanisms intended to govern a larger and more varied territory. Previously, each region had its own leaders, sometimes supported by local elites. With centralization, an administrative division of Egypt into districts, later called nomes by the Greeks, was established. Each nome, often marked by a specific animal or plant totem, was administered by a representative of the royal authority, eventually known as a nomarch. The nomarch reported directly to the court, responsible for collecting taxes, overseeing irrigation works, ensuring canal maintenance, and reporting information on harvests. The tax deposits, often made up of cereals, reflected Egypt's agricultural wealth. The Nile's floods, if well managed, guaranteed abundance and made agricultural productivity the cornerstone of the country's prosperity. However, in case of poor floods, the centralized organization allowed drawing from stocks stored in other nomes to meet the needs of the most affected populations. This professional administration was also accompanied by the beginning of a hierarchy of titles and functions. Scribes, essential for recording all economic life data on papyrus, became crucial cogs in the emerging bureaucracy. They kept records, noted distributed rations, and reported to the highest palace officials. The first drafts of hieroglyphic writing, initiated in the pre-dynastic period, were perfected in the service of these administrative tasks, promoting the development of a true literate culture. At the same time, the militarization of royal authority consolidated. Although the exact extent of Narmer's military campaigns remains unknown, it is undeniable that a core of warriors, loyal to the sovereign, was formed to establish unification. Known archaeologically as Shemsu Hor, literally meaning followers of Horus, this elite group was made up of military leaders and soldiers destined to maintain internal peace and repel potential invasions from Asia or the Sahara. This force constituted an embryo of a regular army, consisting of paid troops capable of projecting royal power throughout the country. Maintaining order and territorial balance also depended on political and symbolic agreements. Local elites could be rewarded with administrative positions and land grants if they recognized the king's authority. This form of vassalization, more or less coercive, allowed the full incorporation of regional notables into the service of the crown. Thus, Narmer and his successors had a network of officials to manage the nomes, collect taxes, and respond to possible revolts. The Egyptian state thus acquired unparalleled institutional solidity, the result of a combination of bureaucratic organization, ritual allegiance, and religious support. Among the political foundations of this unification, it is worth mentioning in more detail the Shemsu Hor. This elite corps, whose name translates as followers of Horus, proved to be the direct armed arm of the sovereign. In many later representations, we see soldiers, officers, or officials wearing insignia reminiscent of their belonging to this group. In the ideological perspective of the time, the king being the earthly incarnation of Horus, these followers of Horus were at the front line to defend the monarch to whom they were intimately bound by a duty of loyalty. The martial equipment of these warriors was improved through commercial contacts with the Near East, which sometimes provided better metallurgy techniques. Arrowheads, once made of flint, began to be made of copper in some regions. Maces, emblematic weapons of royal authority, also became the prerogative of the following officers. Bows and shields, sometimes covered with leather, expressed the growing professionalization of state violence. Beyond simple force, the Shemsu Hor symbolized cohesion around the sacred person of the king. The individuals entering this elite were often chosen for their fighting talents, but also for their family ties with other dignitaries. We can imagine that regional alliances crystallized in the royal court through the incorporation of renowned provincial warriors. This recruitment policy also contributed to the pacification of the country. Bringing potential clan leaders to the center of power guaranteed their loyalty and prevented temptations of revolt. The Shemsu Hor was thus not only an armed force, but also an instrument of propaganda and community integration, announcing the military esprit de corps that would persist in Egyptian history. The fact that these soldiers were directly linked to the deity Horus, symbolized by the king, reinforced the notion of the inviolability of their mission. They were protectors of the sovereign, but also guarantors of the cosmic order, defending the balance established by him who wore the double crown. In ancient Egypt, religion was not separated from politics. On the contrary, it constituted an essential pillar. Narmer, asserting himself as the unique king of the two lands, presented himself as the earthly manifestation of Horus, the falcon god already venerated in Upper Egypt, notably in Nekhen or Hierakonpolis. This identification of the monarch with Horus became the cornerstone of royal legitimation. As the living Horus, the king was vested with a divine mission to maintain Ma'at and repel Isfet. In Egyptian thought, Ma'at symbolizes cosmic order, justice, truth. Isfet, however, refers to chaos and disorder. The notion of duality, Ma'at Isfet, is reflected in rites, iconography, and politics. The king, as the guarantor of harmony, constantly fights against the forces of chaos that threaten to destabilize Egypt. Each military victory, construction of a sacred building, and religious ceremony contributed to the reaffirmation of Ma'at. Conversely, any internal trouble, low flood, or gratuitous act of violence was associated with the influence of Isfet. By attributing to the king the function of mediator between the gods and men, the monarchy assumed a unique role to enable universal balance. As a result, the state religion quickly became an undeniable lever of unification. Temples began to multiply to honor the patron deities of the nomes while recognizing the supremacy of the sovereign, the living Horus. Priests officiating in these sanctuaries had to operate in harmony with the palace directives, ensuring both the continuity of local worship and the memory of the king. Regular offerings were presented, financed by the central authority or agricultural levies. This organization contributed to the overall cohesion of the country, as each district was integrated into a cultic network that, at the top, referred back to the sole holder of sovereignty. The construction of the Temple of Horus at Hierakonpolis perfectly illustrates how the king managed religion in the service of his power. Hierakonpolis already had a long tradition of falcon worship in the pre-dynastic period, and Narmer continued this tradition by consolidating it. The temple, dedicated to the god Horus, became a symbol of unity. Its walls were adorned with representations of the sovereign, showing him receiving life from the god or exercising his function as master of offerings. Through this staging, Narmer secured the theological support necessary to establish his legitimacy. By placing Horus at the center of the official cult, Narmer claimed a prestigious heritage. According to local traditions, several legendary kings had preceded him, sometimes identified as primordial incarnations of Horus. By presenting himself as the new bearer of the falcon, Narmer fully integrated into this mythical chain, linking the beginnings of divine humanity to his actual reign. Thus, the state religion was not limited to ceremonies. It played an active role in shaping a royal ideology, where the succession of mortal kings was only an extension of the permanent presence of Horus. By affirming himself as a mediator between gods and men, the king assumed multiple responsibilities, ensuring the cult, regulating daily life, and dispensing justice. Among the duties of the sovereign was ordering the seasonal rites related to the flood, calling upon the deities to protect the crops, and ensuring the proper conduct of festivities. This ritual regulation aimed to cement the community around common practices and anchor the royal figure in the sacred sphere. At the local level, priests sent reports to the central administration, indicating the needs for resources for offerings and the attendance of holy places. In return, the state sent specialists capable of training new officials or supervising the construction of additional sanctuaries. The official ideology thus infiltrated every corner of the country in the form of common liturgical rules and a shared veneration for the sacred person of the king. For the most part, this religious dimension of the regime was not oppressive. On the contrary, it guaranteed the inhabitants divine protection, materialized by the royal person. Offerings received in the temples were redistributed to priests, officials, and, in times of surplus, to the population to celebrate festive rites. This resulted in a mutual attachment effect. The population perceived the king as a guarantor of prosperity, a being invested with a supernatural function, while the king relied on collective devotion to consolidate his authority. Among the major religious sites of Narmer's time, the Temple of Horus at Hierakonpolis stands out for its antiquity and ideological importance. Hierakonpolis, also known by its Egyptian name Nekhen, was already a cultural center during the pre-dynastic Naqada phases. It is here that the Narmer palette was discovered, reinforcing the idea that Narmer pursued and amplified the tradition of Horus stemming from previous generations of local leaders. The temple, located near the main enclosure of the site, was constructed from perishable materials such as wood, mats, and mud bricks during the early dynasties. The Egyptians had not yet generalized the use of dressed stone for their sanctuaries, but the sacred character of the places was beyond doubt. Numerous pottery, figurines, and ritual objects discovered during archaeological excavations testify to the intensity of the cult. Narmer appeared there as the direct heir of the Falcon Kings, unifying at the same time Upper and Lower Egypt under the emblem of the protective falcon. By dedicating a temple to Horus, Narmer also counterbalanced the cult traditions of other cities. At Buto, in the delta, the cobra goddess Wadjet was venerated, while at Nekeb, on the eastern bank of Upper Egypt, the vulture goddess Nekbet was honored. Over time, these local deities became ancillary symbols of the royalty, forming the pair of the two ladies, Wadjet and Nekbet, who protected the king. However, the core of the ideology remained the fusion of the king and Horus, highlighting the fundamental role of the temple at Hierakonpolis. Grand ceremonies regularly gathered crowds around this ideological center. Multiple offerings, such as jars of beer, baskets of wheat, and meats from royal herds, were presented. Beyond the strict religious aspect, these gatherings fortified social cohesion, bringing together individuals from various regions in a single purpose, to celebrate the unifying power of the Falcon King. Renewal rites, perhaps announcing the annual flood or seasonal festivals, maintained the belief in the protective and regenerative role of the sovereign. All these elements, symbolic conquest, strategic choice of the capital, armed and bureaucratic political mechanisms, centralized state religion, combined to give birth to an unprecedented system of government in the history of the Nile Valley, the pharaonic monarchy. Religion, far from being a simple static cult, reveals itself as a driving force for political adhesion and legitimation. The idea of a hero king, conqueror of the forces of chaos, captivates minds through ceremonies and sacred objects like the Narmer palette. From that moment, Egyptian history evolves under the impetus of an ideology of divine kingship, intertwined with the economic realities of a centralized state. Narmer thus lays the foundations of a new era. Before him, other leaders, sometimes identified as King Scorpion or associated with Nakata III, had initiated a concentration of power. But it is truly with Narmer that the traditional framework adopted by his successors is established. A king vested with a sacred mission, crowned with two crowns marking the unity of the lands, a state structured in nomes, an apparatus of scribes recording the flow of grains and the sovereign's orders, an elite body defending the royal person and bearing the emblem of Horus. This convergence of interests and beliefs ensures a solid foundation for the nascent dynasty. Of course, the process still requires adjustments and reforms, particularly in terms of dynastic succession and provincial management. Some distant regions, more challenging to control, will necessitate the construction of fortresses or outposts. Alliances with Sinai, Byblos, or Nubia will intensify, sometimes leading to latent conflicts, but ultimately strengthening the economic power of the unified kingdom. The inaugural scene of the Narmer Palette, raised mace, white and red crowns displayed, illustrates the precise moment when royal authority transcends divisions. At the same time, the presence of the bull trampling a city wall and the procession of enemy corpses evoke the military force necessary for unification. This dual message, combining legitimate brutality and sacredness, permeates the nascent Egyptian culture. The pharaoh is a conqueror chosen by the gods to establish peace and order. At the beginning of the 3rd millennium before Christ, ancient Egypt consolidates pharaonic authority over the Nile Valley. This era, corresponding to dynasties Thurashan II, sees the emergence of the state organization, administration, and religious symbolism that will shape Egyptian civilization. Menes, often identified with Narmer, had unified Upper and Lower Egypt, according to tradition, paving the way for a line of kings such as Jet, Den, and Mernith. At Abydos, an important religious center, the first monumental tombs appear, affirming royal power. Elaborate tombs and administrative infrastructures spread across the territory, establishing the foundations of an architectural and political legacy that will define later dynasties. Jet, also named Wadji by some historians, directly succeeds a king still poorly identified, sometimes assimilated to Jer. His reign, lasting approximately 10 years, witnesses the strengthening of royal authority in Upper Egypt. Archaeological sources highlight the existence of a rudimentary but already well-organized economy, primarily based on agriculture with grains and flax, livestock with cattle and goats, as well as fishing, taking advantage of the nurturing waters of the Nile. Jet is often associated with Tomb O at Abydos, although it remains difficult to precisely identify the royal burial in question. Within it, steles bear his name inscribed in the Serek, this rectangular frame that underscores the authority of the sovereign. The falcon of Horus already overarches the Serek, expressing the sacred link between the king and the protective deity. The presence of these monuments illustrates not only the consolidation of royal iconography, but also the rise of the arts of engraving and stone carving. At the same time, Jet's reign strengthens the nascent administration responsible for the collection and redistribution of agricultural resources. Officials, directly subordinate to the king, will henceforth record the distribution of goods to better control royal influence in each region. This administrative structuring already foreshadows the development of a more complex bureaucracy, which will become more established in the following decades. After Jet, it is Den who establishes himself as a major king of the First Dynasty, with his reign probably spanning several decades. Sometimes known as Kasti, he consolidates Egyptian authority as far as the southern regions. Archaeological discoveries in Abydos and elsewhere suggest that he led military expeditions to Nubia to ensure regular access to minerals notably gold and copper. Through these operations, Den secures caravan routes and protects the strategic interests of the court, thus ensuring the influx of wealth necessary for the construction of monuments and the maintenance of royal power. Ivory seals testify to increasing administrative innovations. Under Den, the practice of systematically recording the condition of crops and livestock becomes more pronounced, reflecting a concern for centralized management. In parallel, Den is now presented as the guarantor of the connection between the divine world and the earthly world. He reinforces the sacred dimension of the royal function by multiplying rites and offerings. The tombs built in Abydos during his reign become more complex, incorporating larger architecture and varied funerary deposits. This sophistication reflects the early rulers' desire to inscribe themselves in a dynastic continuity and to manifest their power through monuments that are both lasting and evocative of a cosmic order. Among the notable figures at the end of the First Dynasty, Mernith draws particular interest, as she appears to be one of the first women to have assumed a prominent role in the monarchy. Some Egyptologists believe she was the mother or regent of a young heir, while others suggest she may have ruled in her own name, even if only for a limited time. Her name might refer to Beloved of Neith, the warrior goddess worshipped in Sais in the Delta. Excavations in Abydos demonstrate the importance of her funerary complex. It is comparable in size and richness to those of kings of the same period. This fact suggests that she enjoyed an authentic royal status beyond mere regency. Although the documentation remains incomplete, the recognition of Mernith illustrates from these remote times the possibility for a woman of the royal family to govern or exercise supreme power. This reality nuances the idea of exclusively male power and offers an insight into the dynastic flexibility unique to ancient Egypt. At the heart of the period covered by dynasties Tharmarmon II, Abydos remains the great royal necropolis. Located within the enclosure of Thinis and later associated with the cult of Osiris, the city stands out through the magnitude of its funerary edifices. The tombs of these early kings often consist of vast rectangular pits covered with wood or mud bricks and subdivided into several rooms intended for funerary offerings. In some cases, the presence of additional human remains has been noted, suggesting that some servants were buried with the king in a tradition inherited from pre-dynastic practices. The steles, engraved or painted, bearing the royal name, stand in front of these tombs to attest to the identity of the deceased and his divine ties. With the increasingly frequent use of stone for these markers, one glimpses the transition towards more durable monuments. This evolution is not yet that of the Great Pyramids, but it initiates a movement leading to monumental architecture. The tomb indeed becomes the symbolic extension of royalty, a space where the memory of the sovereign and the rites in his honor must be ensured for eternity. One of the central advancements of this period lies in the increasing structuring of the Egyptian bureaucracy. The need to manage vast stocks of grains, to monitor the state of livestock, and to equitably distribute foodstuffs prompted the royal authority to establish a clearly defined body of officials. The title Emi-RPR, meaning Master of the Domain, has come down to us through several inscriptions and seals, and it seems to apply to a high-ranking official responsible for overseeing the palace's resources. The scribes already occupy a crucial rank. Trained in the use of proto-writing and then in the more advanced hieroglyphs, they record, on small ivory supports, the proportion of harvests delivered to the king and the exact number of herds to be maintained. This centralized management of the economy, made possible by a nascent administration, primarily aims at consolidating royal power by ensuring the availability of goods and avoiding shortages. Taxation, or at least the collection of foodstuffs, is implemented according to criteria defined by the court, and each nome also called a province, must comply. The initial impetus for this bureaucracy is closely linked to the need to understand agricultural cycles and the flooding of the Nile in order to coordinate sowing, harvests, and the distribution of provisions. Under the guidance of the king, this structure would have a lasting impact on all subsequent epochs of Egyptian history. In parallel, architecture undergoes a unique phase of experimentation in the history of the Nile Valley. Until then, sun-dried mud brick, made from silt mixed with straw, constituted the primary material of most buildings. However, the end of the First Dynasty sees the emergence of new durability and monumentality demands. At Saqqara, a vast necropolis attached to the city of Memphis, the first mastabas rise. These rectangular structures with sloping walls are constructed in brick, but also with acacia wood for certain elements, marking progress in the search for solidity and finish. The facades may be decorated, showing a nascent aesthetic concern for the funerary exteriors. The still limited use of stone blocks to reinforce certain parts foreshadows the soon-to-be-realized ambition of more imposing architectural projects. For the first time, there is mention of the standardization of the royal cubit, about 52.4 centimeters, serving as a reference for architects and scribes in developing plans. Knotted ropes, an essential tool, allow precise transfer of measurements to the construction site and ensure the alignment of walls. This quest for regularity in construction symbolizes the first tangible expression of the cosmic order the king is supposed to represent, an order in which everything has its place, measured and controlled. Soon, this architectural momentum will lead to major innovations, such as the systematic use of stone for constructing true funerary complexes. While architecture and bureaucracy reflect the royal power's desire for control within the kingdom, the opening to the outside also shows the progressive expansion of Egyptian influence. The sovereigns of the First and Second Dynasties launch exploration missions to acquire essential raw materials for the production of prestigious objects and the maintenance of cults. In the Sinai Peninsula, the reliefs of Wadi Magare, engraved by the Egyptians, show the importance of turquoise, a sacred stone with a blue color evocative of rebirth. The extraction and transport of this resource required the creation of specialized teams, overseen by officers in direct service to the king. Further south, at Elephantine diorite, a hard rock highly prized for luxury vessels and ritual statues deposited in temples, is exploited. The region of the First Cataract thus becomes a key transit point where boats loaded with stone blocks or other precious goods converge northward. Finally, Nubia remains a major strategic stake. In the Bauhan area near the Second Cataract, gold abounds in the deposits of the eastern desert. Fortified trading posts are established to secure supply and assert Egyptian authority over these territories. Exploiting these riches allows the king to display growing prestige, both in offerings made to the gods and in the luxury of the court. This network of expeditions, exchanges, and military control foreshadows the much wider influence Egypt will exert in later periods, as it already lays the foundations of a centralized economy focused on the valuation and redistribution of high-quality resources. Since the dawn of time, the inhabitants of the Nile Valley have sought to understand and recount their origins, to reveal how the world and their civilization came into being. For an international audience discovering these complex beliefs for the first time, it is important to take the story step by step to decipher the symbols and divine figures whose mention spans the entire pharaonic history. The ancient Egyptians referred to several cosmogonic traditions, that is, narratives describing the birth of the universe and the emergence of the gods. Among these stories, two main groups stand out particularly: the Heliopolitan cosmogony and the Memphite cosmogony. The priests and kings found in these myths a theological foundation for kingship, notably by asserting that royal power stemmed from the primordial cosmic order. Rebirth rites, such as the great Heb-Sed festival, complemented this scheme by renewing the sovereign's vigor and reaffirming his role as an intermediary between the material world and divine forces. All this contributed, through lavish ceremonies and official inscriptions, to cementing the idea that pharaonic Egypt was intimately linked to the primordial order. To better grasp this vision, let us examine these different elements step by step. First, the tradition from Heliopolis, then that of Memphis, before seeing how the first time, also called Zep Tepi, and the propaganda inscribed in stone linked royalty to the gods, and finally the celebration of the Heb-Sed, a major milestone in the king's rebirth. In the city of Heliopolis, known in Egyptian as Yunu, located to the northeast of present-day Cairo, a great intellectual and religious center was formed around the solar cult. It is here that the following foundational narrative presumably took shape. At the beginning, there existed only Nun, a primordial ocean symbolizing infinity, where everything was still formless and without limits. Within these waters, a creative force named Atum gradually distinguished itself. The Egyptians often represented Atum as an anthropomorphic god, sometimes associated with the solar disk. In essence, Atum embodied the all, the generative principle of all beings. According to the High Heliopolitan tradition, Atum emerged from Nun and settled on a sacred mound called the Benben, an elevation of land emerging from the chaotic waters. The image of the Benben became both an architectural symbol, as evidenced by the obelisks and pyramids that were inspired by it, and a spiritual concept, representing the first elevation of the earth out of the aquatic chaos. Once established on this divine mound, Atum found himself alone. In some variants of the myth, he creates himself, sometimes depicted as engendering himself through a symbolic act. He is both father and mother, needing no other to exist. Atum then began his creation. He engendered two cosmic entities, Shu and Tefnut, often mentioned as a couple representing air and moisture respectively. Shu, the god of air and vital breath, had the function of maintaining the cohesion between sky and earth. Tefnut, his consort, associated with moisture, ensured the dynamics of life and the fertility to come. From this mythical union were born Geb, the earth, and Nut, the sky, often depicted in sacred art as a reclining man to personify Geb, and a woman arching her star-studded body above him to embody Nut. The scenario continues. Geb and Nut, also united, then gave birth to 4 children who would play a crucial role in the Egyptian religious history: Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Nephthys. Osiris and Isis were linked to fertility, resurrection, and royalty. Seth, in contrast, embodied brute force, often associated with violence in the desert. Nephthys, the most discreet of the 4, became the guardian of funeral mysteries, protector of the deceased, alongside Isis. Together, these gods formed the Ennead, a modern term to designate the group of 9 fundamental deities arising from this lineage: Atum, Shu, Tefnut, Geb, Nut, Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Nephthys. This genealogy structured the Heliopolitan theology, which the priests taught to emphasize the orderly nature of creation. The arrangement of the cosmos, from the emergence of the Benben to the distribution of roles among each of these divine forces, thus found its coherence in the narrative. At the heart of this system, the king, called pharaoh in our modern vocabulary, although this term only became prevalent later, assumed the sacred mission of maintaining Ma'at, that is to say, order, justice, and cosmic balance. His primary role lay in the struggle against the opposite of Ma'at, Isfet, disorder and chaos, embodied by the malevolent figure of Apophis, a monster often described as a great serpent seeking to destroy creation. Surviving the dawn of each day equated, for the sun and for Egypt, to pushing Apophis back into the darkness once again. This eternal combat represented the daily battle against annihilation, and the king, as the guarantor of harmony, had to offer rituals and prayers on behalf of the entire community so that creation would not plunge into confusion. The use of symbols such as the crown, the scepter, and the different emulations of the god Horus reminded the sacred function of the sovereign. He was, in the Egyptian religious tradition, a living extension of Atum and the entire Ennead, invested to protect his people and perpetuate the cosmic order. While Heliopolis dedicated itself to the solar cult in its founding narrative, Memphis further south developed its own version of cosmogony. Based on the god Ptah, the Memphite theology placed thought and speech at the forefront. Ptah, the creator deity, was sometimes portrayed as a craftsman or a smith wrapped in a shroud. It was said that he conceived the world in his heart, then brought it into existence through his tongue. In this conception, Ptah's heart, a symbol of intellect and will, represented the seat of thought, that is to say, the place where all creation plans are born. As for the tongue, it symbolized speech, the creative tool that materializes divine thought in the world. It is essential to understand this nuance. For the priests of Memphis, the primordial force was not simply physical or resulting from an act of procreation, but first intellectual, conceptual. Thus, Ptah thinks of every aspect of existence, whether it is gods, humans, animals, or natural elements. As soon as this mental conception is completed, Ptah pronounces it, and the element takes form in reality, becoming an independent being. This idea, inscribed on the famous Shabaka stone, a block of basalt preserving part of the Memphite teachings, emphasized the power of words. For an international person discovering these notions, one can see a parallel with other traditions where divine speech is the origin of the world. But among the Egyptians, it was accompanied by very concrete images. Ptah is both the ideating demiurge and the craftsman capable of constructing reality. In this same theology, the white crown held a particular significance. It was considered the home of the vital force, a concentration of divine energy that the king, as the god's representative on earth, took upon himself to preserve the world's coherence. This crown, a symbol of Upper Egypt, combined with the red crown, that of Lower Egypt, once illustrated the reunion of the kingdom's two halves. However, in the specific case of the Memphite tradition, the emphasis was not only on geographical fusion, but also on the union of the creative power, also called Ptah, and the earthly royal power. The king, endowed with this force, ensured that the balance between Ma'at and Isfet remained favorable to life. Much like in Heliopolis, the sovereign assumed a divine role and became, within Memphis, the interface between the creative idea and the manifested order. This complementarity between speech and action, between Ptah's thought and royal governance, stimulated Egyptian religious life. Each time the pharaoh ascended the throne, it reminded them that his mandate was not merely political. It reactivated, in a way, the foundational act of creation as conceived by Ptah. In both the narrative of Heliopolis and that of Memphis, the Egyptians insisted on the irreducible origin, this moment outside of time, during which the gods created the world. They called this period Zep Tepi, generally translated as the first time or the first occasion. It was not just about a mythical past. For the ancient Egyptians, Zep Tepi could be reactivated during certain rituals, offering the creative energy once again to present events. Returning to Zep Tepi meant drawing from the intact power of the moment when the cosmos emerged from chaos. In the collective Egyptian consciousness, this first time represented the Golden Age, when the gods directly ruled over the Nile Valley before handing the scepter to human kings. In other words, when proclaiming the sovereign as a direct heir of the gods, the idea was that the pharaoh concretely inherited this divine governance inaugurated at Zep Tepi. This lineage extended from Atum or Ptah, according to traditions, through to the first human dynasties, and was maintained through each successor. Indeed, each royal enthronement was perceived as a renewal of the world, because the coronation recharged the link between Ma'at and tangible reality. Priests and scribes drew upon the sacred memory of Zep Tepi to legitimize the current power. For example, when a new reign began, ceremonies were conducted reminiscent of Atum's ascent on the Benben or the creation by the word of Ptah, as if the very birth of the king reenacted the birth of the cosmos. This conception also gave a religiously strong meaning to dynastic continuity. The destiny of Egypt was intertwined with the maintenance of the system created at the dawn of time, that system which Shu, Tefnut, Geb, Nut, and their descendants had shaped. Natural cycles, such as the annual flooding of the Nile and the daily solar cycle, were considered as returns to Zep Tepi. The cosmic ideal remained the same: to preserve creation against the chaotic forces that continuously threatened to resurface. Ceremonies dedicated to Osiris, for example, regularly reminded that even when the god died and was dismembered, he was brought back to life, closing this cycle with a rebirth. Thus, the Egyptian religious edifice offered the possibility of rebirth by drawing from the primordial source of the first time, preserved in collective memory and sacred rites. To anchor these traditions in popular consciousness and legitimize the ruling dynasty, priests and scribes multiplied inscriptions on various supports: temple walls, papyri, funerary steles, and sometimes, as archaeological sources recount, in chambers or sacred rooms of a temple. The texts of the White Chambers constitute an emblematic example of this propagandist practice. The term propaganda might seem anachronistic, but in ancient Egypt, all official religious communication had the explicit purpose of spreading and reinforcing the idea that royalty derived from the gods themselves. These texts, according to the fragmentary remains we have, featured a royal list beginning with Hor-Aha, one of the very first kings of unified Egypt, sometimes dated around 3100 or 3050, according to modern estimates. The Egyptians themselves considered Hor-Aha as the direct heir of the deities, marking the transition between the time when the valley still belonged to divine forces and the era of human kings. In this long list, each sovereign's name was linked to a protective deity or a mythical act, thus weaving an unbroken link between Zep Tepi and the present moment, at least as it was at the time of engraving. The king served almost as a bridge between the gods and future generations, with the duty to pass on the flame of creation. At the same time, these inscriptions reminded people that the pharaoh did not act as a mere warrior chief or administrator, but as a divine mediator. With each mention of a new military campaign, an irrigation project, or the founding of a temple, the text indicated how the king continued the work of his mythical ancestors, ensuring the perpetuity of Ma'at. The pedagogical and spiritual goal of these reliefs was to convince the population and the elites that outside legitimate royalty, no one could ensure Egypt's survival against Isfet. Public ceremonies around these white chambers reinforced the sense of an exceptional destiny, supported by the entire divine universe. Thus, one was not just reading a list of names, but entering into communion with the sacred history of the kingdom, from Horaha, supported by the gods, to the reigning sovereign, who was part of this immutable lineage. At the heart of Egyptian royal ideology is the idea that, in order to continue fighting effectively against Apophis, the king must periodically renew his vigor. Old age or the wear of time inevitably threatened the sovereign's energy. How to ensure that Ma'at would remain protected if the king grew tired or fell ill? The Egyptians provided an answer with the Hebsed festival, a royal jubilee celebrated on the 30th anniversary of ascending to the throne, and sometimes repeated every 3 years thereafter. Its purpose is to revitalize the pharaoh, restoring the strength of youth, as if a divine power were injecting new sap into him to prolong his reign and maintain cosmic order. The Hebsed's proceedings adhered to a well-established protocol. In the festival courtyard, specially arranged for this occasion, the king donned specific outfits symbolizing various deities and aspects of royalty. According to the rites, boundary markers or stelae designating the kingdom's extent were placed. The festival's crucial moment, and perhaps the most spectacular to the witnesses, was the king's run between two markers representing Upper and Lower Egypt. By covering this distance again, he proved his vitality and demonstrated that he could still exercise his sacred guardianship over all two lands, Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north. He thus publicly manifested his physical aptitude to govern, as well as his ritual ability to unify the territory. Beyond the athletic performance, this rite condensed the key themes of royal theology: the reconstruction of Zep Tepi through the act of rebirth, the proclamation of the king as an heir of the gods, and the demonstration that Ma'at remained firmly rooted in the country. Courtiers, the royal family, and, presumably, representatives of the provinces or even foreign delegations attended the ceremony to officially recognize this renewal of royal energy. The Hebsed was therefore simultaneously a religious act, a manifestation of power, and a political declaration. By donning sacred insignia, accepting offerings from the temples, and pronouncing ritual formulas, the king declared that he was restoring the primordial order as it was instituted by Atum, Ta, or the Osirian cycle, depending on the tradition emphasized. It was a pledge of prolonged stability, a message meant for both gods and men. On a symbolic level, the root of this ceremony referred to cosmogonic ideas. The primordial energy that had erupted from the Nun was at the core of the Hebsed's dynamics. Accustomed to the standards of a simple monarchy, a foreign observer would probably have been struck by the sacred dimension of this jubilee. The entire city was adorned with decorations, processions paid homage to the pharaoh's divine strength, and offerings of food, ointments, and perfumes were deposited in the sanctuaries. The rhythm of drums and sistrums, a sacred musical instrument, emphasized the festive aspect, while the highest priests performed codified prayers to invoke the blessing of the gods. Furthermore, the Hebsed reinforced royal propaganda. Even if the people did not understand all the theological details, they witnessed the king running, literally, to affirm his union with the country's two extremities. Iconographic representations, especially well preserved in some tombs and in later bas-reliefs, showed the sovereign clad in a bull's tail, a symbol of strength, while he completed his course. Commemorative stelae, engraved on this occasion, sometimes mention the Jubilee date and the divine names associated with the pharaoh, reminding that the act was not merely human, but guided by divine will itself. For an international audience, the Hebsed could be compared to certain rites of passage found in various cultures, where a leader must regularly confirm the strength of their power. But in Egypt, everything took on a cosmic dimension. The king was not just another leader, he ensured the connection between the created world and the threat of nothingness. The renewal he achieved through the ritual dance and sacred race legitimized this status. In the same spirit, when he donned the white crown, this reserve of vital force, according to Memphite conception, he demonstrated that Ptah, Adam, or the primordial divine principle, continued to emanate in him. Thus, the whole country embarked on a cycle where Ma'at, once again, was confirmed. Without the sovereign's strength, the Nile Valley, in the Egyptian imagination, could have been invaded by the tentacles of Apophis, and the Nun, in its chaotic version, would have engulfed the established order. At the end of this journey through the Heliopolitan cosmogony, the Memphite cosmogony, the concept of Zep Tepi, official inscriptions, and the celebration of Hebsed, a mental universe emerges where the birth of Egypt is inseparable from the birth of the cosmos. For the people of the time, the idea that Atum emerged from the Nun, or that Ta thought the world in his heart, gave meaning to the workings of everyday life. The flooding of the Nile, the rising of the sun, the protection of the king, the germination of seeds, all referred to a dynamic set in motion by the gods. The king, endowed with divine power, could repel chaos and regularly relaunch creation at key moments like the Hebsed Jubilee. The latter symbolized the eternal rebirth of legitimate power, the assurance that Egypt would continue to prosper under the watchful eye of the gods, perpetuating the rise undertaken since the first time. Thus, this is how the ancient Egyptians told their own birth, a divine act repeated and updated with each reign, each year, each sunrise. Heliopolis reminded that the world was born from a sacred mound, the Benben, carried by Atum. Memphis proposed the idea that a demiurge, Ta, first conceived in his heart the harmony of creation before pronouncing it with his tongue. The Zep Tepi described the moment when the gods settled in the Nile Valley, and later entrusted its governance to humans. The texts of the White Chambers linked the lineage of kings to this uninterrupted tradition, and the Hebsed festival ensured that, whatever the trials, royal vitality was never broken. Thus, cosmogony, royalty, and celebration merged into an organic whole, an incessant cycle of death and rebirth, guaranteeing the perpetual survival of Egypt and its civilization. At the dusk of the Second Egyptian dynasty, around 2750 before Christ, royal power crossed a major threshold by consolidating and spreading the foundations of the pharaonic system. This culmination, marking the end of Dynasty II, is reflected in the sovereign's desire to strengthen the country's unity while integrating new strategic regions. Indeed, the Egyptian monarchy was no longer just a power centered on a few Nilotic areas, but a government implementing an expanded management of territories. This crucial phase saw the emergence of satellite provinces, the development of the Fayum Oasis, the refinement of hieroglyphs, the establishment of a precise civil calendar, and the expansion of a centralized economy. All these elements echoed and supported each other under the leadership of a sovereign who presented himself as the guarantor of cosmic order. The last decades of Dynasty II, embodied by kings like Peribsen or Khasakemwi, thus constitute a historical backdrop where Egypt felt the need to affirm its cohesion and perpetuate its model. Through the installation of garrisons, the fortification of major trade routes, and the construction of sanctuaries, the pharaoh imposed a new vision of kingship with a subtle balance between military power, control of natural resources, and religious recognition. The establishment of satellite provinces, particularly in the Western Delta, constitutes one of the main aspects of this consolidation policy. Located near the current town of Sa el Hagar, the city of Sais occupies a strategic position on a branch of the Nile. At the end of the Second Dynasty, Sais gained importance thanks to the creation of a naval base intended to monitor the Libyan region and protect maritime trade. The rulers relied on armed contingents and suitable port infrastructures to prevent any foreign incursion. Although fragmentary, archaeological sources suggest the existence of rudimentary docks and storage rooms, indicating sustained military and logistical activity. This setup also secures the flow of goods, such as wood, oil, or mineral products, to or from the Mediterranean. The location of Sais, at the crossroads of river and land routes, reinforces its role as a commercial hub. Thus, the Western Delta becomes an essential link in the pharaonic structure, illustrating the royal intention to assert authority to the edges of its territory and maintain the country's prosperity. In parallel, the Fayoum Oasis, located southwest of the Memphite region, emerges as the second major center of territorial expansion at the end of the Second Dynasty. This vast natural depression, fed by a derived branch of the Nile, presents considerable agricultural potential. The monarchs quickly perceived the advantage of converting these wetlands into rich fields dedicated to cereal cultivation or viticulture. Supervised by appointed officials, complex irrigation and drainage works were undertaken to channel the waters, thus optimizing soil fertility. The oasis then became a vital reservoir for feeding the population and building up stocks in case of shortages. However, the Fayoum is not just a simple granary. It houses an ancient cult devoted to Sobek, the crocodile god. Considered a protector linked to the waters, Sobek enjoyed increased devotion under these kings, eager to legitimize their power. Through the construction or renovation of sanctuaries dedicated to the deity, the pharaoh found a way to unite the population around an official religion. Thus, the Fayoum Oasis perfectly illustrates the dual economic and spiritual ambition of the pharaonic regime during these final years of the II dynasty. Culturally, the widespread use of hieroglyphics reached an unprecedented form of maturity at this time. Gradually detached from pure figuration, writing was endowed with biliteral and triliteral signs, thereby reducing the number of symbols needed to express complex ideas or multiple names. Scribes, trained in the houses of life attached to temples, perfected the mastery of this sacred alphabet to serve the state's needs. They drafted decrees, recorded harvests, and recounted major events, such as the inauguration of new monuments or the holding of religious festivities. In these establishments, the scribe institution consolidated into a specialized body, serving an increasingly demanding administration. Far from being just a tool, writing became the principal vector of royal propaganda, as it immortalized the sovereign's titles and official ceremonies. Clay or ivory seals, engraved with hieroglyphs, attested to the authenticity of an order or the validity of a transaction. Thanks to this increased dissemination of writing, the pharaoh extended his administrative and symbolic control over the entire territory, laying the foundations for a bureaucracy that would flourish under subsequent dynasties. The House of Life remains the epicenter of scribe training and the development of sacred texts. In these scriptorium schools, the art of handling the reed and ink is coupled with religious learning, as liturgical and mythological texts form the foundation of Egyptian culture. Here, dynastic history, ritual formulas, and purity rules are taught to form an intellectual elite devoted to the cult and the state. The best elements are sometimes promoted to the rank of high officials, tasked with supervising the recording of taxes, the distribution of resources, or diplomatic correspondence with neighboring countries. As mastering hieroglyphics requires memory and attention to detail, the selection remains strict, and social ascension via the scribal route is reserved for a few privileged individuals. Thus, in Egypt at the end of the Second Dynasty, mastery of writing imposes itself as an instrument of power and distinction. Through the meticulous reproduction of formulas, the scribes also perpetuate the royal ideology, celebrating the figure of the pharaoh as the pivot between the divine world and the human community. This symbiosis between religion and administration reverberates throughout the entire society. Another pillar of pharaonic consolidation lies in the adoption of a civil calendar consisting of 365 days. The Egyptians had long noticed the coincidence between the heliacal rising of the star Sirius, also called Sopdet, and the flooding of the Nile. Towards the end of the Second Dynasty, this celestial phenomenon is integrated into a more coherent calendrical system with 12 months of 30 days, plus 5 additional days, often dedicated to religious festivals. Although this calendar does not account for the extra quarter day and gradually shifts concerning the solar year, it offers a precise structure for agricultural and ritual planning. State agents can now set clear deadlines for tax collection, field cultivation, and the organization of major liturgical events. The importance of the Nile cycle is reflected in the vocabulary. Akhet means inundation, Peret meaning germination, and Shemu meaning harvest rhythm, the economic and spiritual life. This segmentation of time reinforces the authority of the pharaoh, deemed the guarantor of cosmic order and responsible for the proper functioning of the seasons. By ensuring synchronization among temple servants, scribes, and officers, the civil calendar actively participates in national cohesion. On the theological level, the link between the Nile's flooding and the appearance of Sirius illustrates the Egyptians' deep belief in a universe regulated by divine forces. The kings of the late Second Dynasty exploit this belief to consolidate their legitimacy. If the flood is abundant, it is because the pharaoh, invested with sacred powers, has managed to ensure the order of things. Through various festivals and processions, priests express the community's gratitude towards the deities, while reaffirming the central role of the sovereign as mediator. In the temples, representations of Sopdet, sometimes associated with the goddess Isis, remind that the star brings rebirth and that the river, with its silt, transforms the valley into a fertile garden. The mural inscriptions, now written in more evolved hieroglyphs, often associate the king with the gods Hapi and Osiris, intimately linked to the vegetation cycle. This sacred discourse serves a political purpose to instigate popular adherence, reinforce royal authority, and perpetuate the allegiance of local elites. Similarly, the celebration of the New Year, modeled on the rising of Sirius, becomes a privileged moment to redistribute goods or announce administrative decisions, testifying to the normative power of this civil calendar. This obsession with the harmony of time and nature aligns with the progressive centralization of the economy. The harvests, collected from each province, are stored in vast silos connected to the royal power. Memphis, which then serves as an administrative hub, sees the flourishing of storage complexes where wheat, barley, and other commodities pile up. Archives mention clay or ivory seals affixed to jars and bags, bearing the name of the pharaoh or the official in charge of supervising these granaries. When a local shortage or poor harvest occurs, the state can redistribute these resources in a planned manner, thus avoiding large-scale famines and preserving social stability. Registers kept by scribes record the amount of grain delivered by each region, and adherence to quotas becomes an indicator of loyalty to the sovereign. In some inscriptions, allusions to audits and verifications suggest the existence of a sophisticated control system, ensuring the proper functioning of this logistics. The pharaohs at the end of the Second Dynasty thus consolidate their grip over the entire territory, presenting themselves as protectors of a shared and enduring agricultural prosperity. The organization of this planned economy also extends to critical periods when the Nile's flood fails. In these situations, the royal stocks play a life-saving role. The distribution of grain, supervised by sworn officials, helps maintain cohesion and elicit popular recognition towards the crown. The official seals, made of wax or clay, guarantee that every delivery indeed comes from the state reserve. Some specimens, discovered in funerary sites or old warehouses, reveal specific mentions like the year of famine, suggesting that starvation was feared enough to justify administrative codification. Provincial governors, or nomarchs, then ensure equitable distribution of rations, avoiding speculation and rebellion. However, this centralization does not fail to provoke rivalries. Indeed, local elites may attempt to establish their own power base, taking advantage of their position to enrich themselves or challenge the pharaoh's control. Despite these pitfalls, the system established at the end of the Second Dynasty remains overall effective. This model of the pharaonic economy, where the state assumes the role of supreme distributor, is perpetuated in Egyptian tradition and influences subsequent administrative structures. By the end of the Second Dynasty, Egypt thus presents itself as a unified kingdom, endowed with a sophisticated administration and a strong sense of belonging. The satellite provinces established in the Western Delta, with Sais as a symbol, secure the maritime borders and consolidate trade links oriented towards the Mediterranean. The Fayoum Oasis, for its part, becomes an agricultural hub and a sanctuary dedicated to Sobek, strengthening the spiritual bond between the pharaoh and the fertility of the Nile. Culturally, the hieroglyphic writing, perfected in the Houses of Life, seals the rise of a complex bureaucracy and ensures the transmission of royal orders with unprecedented precision until then. The civil calendar, anchored to the observation of Sirius, standardizes religious and economic life, synchronizing sowing, celebrations, and tax collections. Finally, the centralization of the economy, embodied by royal silos and the redistribution of resources, consecrates the king as the provider of the common good. This pharaonic model, which strengthens gradually, will continue and enrich under later dynasties, reaching its zenith in monumental constructions and a vast diplomatic influence. At this stage, the end of the Second Dynasty already marks a crucial milestone in the affirmation of Egyptian civilization. In the immediate aftermath of the first Egyptian dynasties, the Nile Valley enters a decisive phase that will lead to the emergence of the Old Kingdom. This transitional moment is characterized by ongoing architectural, administrative, and religious innovations, whose impact will durably shape pharaonic history. Around the end of the Second Dynasty, around 2700 before Christ, a series of transformations heralds the consolidation of authority structures and the rise of a centralized organization capable of coordinating ambitious projects. Memphis, having become the capital since unification, continues to play a leading role, while sites like Saqqara acquire new importance thanks to the architectural developments they house. In this environment fertile with changes, funerary conceptions are refined, administration is perfected, and the spread of the Egyptian religious model beyond the Memphite basin accelerates. In parallel, the first milestones are laid in the realm of collective memory and the recording of major royal events, elevating the Egyptian chronology to an unprecedented level of precision for the time. This period, called pre-Third Dynasty in traditional history, sees the emergence of figures of future builders and deified advisors, whose fame will remain engraved in the marble of temples and in the hearts of believers. Thus, the mark left by funerary art, the rationalization of the state, and religious fervor prepares the ground for the erection of the Great Pyramids of the 3rd millennium before Christ. It is in this complex context, marked by a conjunction of economic, political, and spiritual factors, that ancient Egypt is about to cross the threshold of a monumental era and to imprint in stone the now unwavering ambition of its rulers. Since the very first dynasties, the most common form of burial remains the mastaba, a trapezoidal edifice built of mud bricks, sometimes surmounted by a small chapel intended for funerary worship. This space housed the burial chamber as well as a serdab, that is, a closed room where the statue of the deceased was placed so it could symbolically receive offerings and prayers. Already under the reigns of the 1st and 2nd dynasties, there is a desire to differentiate royal tombs from those of individuals. Kings seek to distinguish themselves through a larger structure, more elaborate underground corridors, and an arrangement that pays homage to their divine status. In Saqqara, a vast necropolis on the outskirts of Memphis, we observe attempts at the successive stacking of mastabas, where several levels rise on top of one another to achieve greater height. This innovation, still experimental at the end of the 2nd dynasty, reflects the growing desire to mark verticality and affirm the sovereign's presence in the funerary horizon. This desire for elevation also reflects a religious imagination, according to which the king's tomb must come closer to the sky, the domain of the deities. The early experiments, often carried out in mud brick, seem to have prompted reflection on the durability of the structure. Natural erosion and water infiltration called into question the long-term solidity of such projects. The architects of the time, therefore, perceived the need to test cut stone and to develop an adequate technique for erecting something even more resilient. Of course, we're not yet talking about the famous step pyramid of Djoser in the 3rd dynasty, designed by Imhotep, but the seed of it can already be seen in this principle of superposition. This approach, bold for the time, anchors the idea that the royal funerary construction is not merely a functional monument, but an object of prestige and experimentation that anticipates the pyramidal model characteristic of the Old Kingdom. Beyond funeral innovations, the royal power strives to strengthen governance structures. The objective is to coordinate the ever-increasing resources and impose effective authority over a territory that extends from the northern delta to the First Cataract in Nubia. This emerging coherence is particularly manifested in the development of a cadastral inventory of the Nile. The royal administration seeks, indeed, to map the floodplains, cultivable fields, and lands allocated to the cult or the crown. Teams of scribes and officials, sometimes sent over long distances, methodically account for natural resources, livestock, and the population itself. The annual regularity of the Nile flood, which periodically reshapes the agricultural landscape, makes this work indispensable for calculating taxes and anticipating harvests. At the end of the 2nd dynasty, the principle of the double census festival is established. Every 2 years or so, a precise count of goods and inhabitants is conducted to measure the kingdom's prosperity. During these ceremonies, the sovereign celebrates his protective and unifying role, presenting himself as the guarantor of the fair distribution of resources. This operation also strengthens political ties between the palace and the nomes, the administrative subdivisions of the Nile Valley, at the head of which are governors, sometimes from the local elite. These governors, or nomarchs, are subject to the supreme authority of the king, but nevertheless benefit from a certain degree of autonomy to manage daily affairs. The effectiveness of such a system marks a notable progress compared to previous periods where power rested on more informal relationships. Now, the pharaonic state is endowed with more sophisticated means of control, with written registers, fiscal protocols, and a larger body of scribes. The circulation of these administrators further reinforces cultural unity, promoting the exchange of official documents, ritual practices, and artistic styles from one region to another. As long as Egypt remains united by the same religious expression, the question of the king's legitimacy does not arise. However, the now visible extension of royal authority throughout the territory leads to a broader diffusion of cults and ritual practices once centered on Memphis or major sites in Upper Egypt. Each province begins to erect its own temple, often in direct imitation of the Memphite sanctuaries, to honor local deities while recognizing the supremacy of the pharaoh's religious status. At the end of this second dynasty, the cult of Horus, the falcon god traditionally associated with monarchy, spreads to many cities that seek to maintain their loyalty to the crown. The emblem of the falcon, a symbol of the king's celestial authority, is often found in provincial temple decorations, on bas-reliefs, or in the sculpture of small votive steles. At the same time, the cult of Anubis, the jackal god of funerary rites, grows in importance. Local communities indeed adopt forms of cult organization similar to those of the center, with hierarchical priests overseeing processions and offerings. By replicating Memphite architecture, liturgy, and symbolism, these satellite temples reinforce the idea that the entire Nile Valley forms an indivisible kingdom under the unique aegis of the divine sovereign. This strategy also ensures the homogeneity of the doctrine. By disqualifying potential divergences and promoting a unified religious discourse, the king secures the moral and spiritual support of local elites, who themselves benefit from this convergence to legitimize their own position. Gradually, the entire territory presents comparable cult structures, so that a traveler sailing from Memphis to the confines of Upper Egypt can become familiar with the same forms of rituals, the same representations of deities, and the same affirmation of royal authority above all. In this Egypt on the path to homogenization, historical memory begins to formalize in a more systematic manner. The most striking example in this regard remains the Stela of Kiaa, a ruler from the end of the First Dynasty around 2900 before Christ E. On this stela, we see for the first time the idea of official annals, a textual device used to commemorate the achievements and major events of the reign, foundation of temples, censuses, military victories, or commercial expeditions. This system, sometimes referred to as year name, consists of naming the year after a significant event, for example, year of the conquest of Nubia, or year of the creation of the great temple of Horus. Thus, rather than referring to abstract numbers, each period is anchored in a collective narrative. During the Second Dynasty, this practice evolves and expands. There is an increase in documents on ivory, wood, or even clay tablets, thus tracing the chronology of the reign. They record sacred offerings, funerary donations, or gold shipments from Nubia. This desire to leave a lasting trace responds to the necessity for the crown to justify its legitimacy and affirm the durability of its power. The Egyptian people, particularly scribes and intellectuals, become increasingly aware of the importance of writing to classify and magnify significant accomplishments. These archives, carefully preserved in specific places within the palatial complex or temples, offer a new form of historical continuity, and future rulers can refer to them to claim the heritage of their predecessors, strengthen the dynasty's cohesion, and illuminate their own political decisions in light of the past. Therefore, a culture of official recording develops, a precursor to the development of more structured archives that will culminate in the Old Kingdom era. On a historical level, These reforms in administration, religion, and collective memory contribute to creating the framework conducive to the emergence of a truly pyramidal era. Several factors converge toward the end of the Second Dynasty to accelerate this process. Firstly, there is a stabilization of the Egyptian borders. The frontier zones with Libya and Sinai seem relatively calm, while the Nubian region, though sporadically agitated, remains largely under control. This tranquility, unprecedented considering the centuries of state formation, allows for concentrating resources and attention on large internal projects. Secondly, cereal abundance, resulting from a continuous improvement in agricultural techniques and the distribution of irrigation waters, provides the crown with surplus food reserves. These surpluses facilitate the maintenance of an increasingly skilled workforce, as it becomes possible to mobilize specialized teams throughout the year and compensate workers in kind or through other benefits. Thirdly, there is increased divine legitimization. The kings of the Second Dynasty emphasize their lineage with mythical ancestors and reinforce propaganda, notably through spectacular ceremonies that associate the people with the crown's grand rites. When these elements align, the monarch is able to launch ambitious constructions, not only for personal prestige, but also to engrave in stone the message of a powerful and unified Egypt for centuries to come. This gradual transition, spread over a few decades, actually marks a radical change in monumental culture. The desire to increasingly build in stone, the solidity of the funerary complexes, the growing mastery of sacred geometry, all announce the architectural explosion of the Third Dynasty. Even though the Great Pyramids of Giza still belong to the future, particularly the Fourth Dynasty, the foundation of this pyramidal civilization is already being laid with the consolidation of the state, administrative centralization, and religious fervor united around a god-king. Fundamentally, the rise of monumental stone architecture cannot be understood without the emergence of a new professional category, such as highly trained priest architects, capable of designing unprecedented buildings while adhering to ritual prescriptions. Before the official appearance of Imhotep, who would later be presented as the chief designer of King Djoser's step pyramid, the foundations of this synthesis between construction technique and sacred knowledge were gradually put in place. At Nakon, a site also known by the Greek name Hierakonpolis, excavations suggest the experimental use of cut stone in certain cultic areas, although large monumental structures had not yet been erected there. In these workshops, where sculptors, stonecutters, and religious officiants came together, the idea was born that the architecture idea could serve as a symbolic echo to the cosmic order. The transition from mud brick to stone reflected not only a search for durability, but also a desire to glorify the deity with a material perceived as nobler and more capable of withstanding the test of time. Priest architects, with Imhotep as their archetype, used their knowledge in mathematics, geometry, cosmology, and rituals to compile ever more accurate plans. When a royal construction project was initiated, they were responsible for ensuring that each element met sacred canons, orientation according to cardinal points, harmonious sizing, symbolic decoration. All this was not done with a snap of the fingers. It was an evolution that required years of trial and error, comparison between various attempts, and accumulation of know-how. By the end of the Second Dynasty, Egypt already had a tradition of engineers and artists skilled in working stone, as evidenced by certain statues, reliefs, and primitive columns. But the idea of applying it on a large scale in funerary construction awaited only a talented master builder to be realized. Thus, Imhotep, a historical figure, would later become a quasi-divine figure, honored as a sage and healer, symbolizing this fusion between sacred knowledge and the art of building. As internal organization strengthened, commercial relations experienced sustained development. Under the Second Dynasty, the royal court confirmed maritime and land routes already outlined since the pre-dynastic era, but now institutionalized. Two main destinations stood out. First, Byblos, a port city on the Levantine coast in present-day Lebanon, renowned for its cedar forests. Cedar wood was prized for shipbuilding and for creating frameworks or precious architectural elements within the temples. These long and robust trunks, impossible to find on Egyptian soil, justified the establishment of regular diplomatic exchanges. Caravans or ships returning from Byblos brought back this sought-after wood, while Egypt exported grains, linen, and occasionally manufactured jewelry items. Then, the other major trade route led to the land of Punt, whose exact location has not been definitively established, but tradition places it on the African coast of the Red Sea, in the modern regions of Eritrea and Somalia. There, one could find myrrh, incense resin, ebony, and sometimes exotic animals like baboons or rare felines, which fascinated the Egyptian court. These exchanges underscore the pharaonic power's desire to extend beyond its borders while affirming the technical capability of its sailors to navigate along the Red Sea coasts or towards the eastern Mediterranean. Moreover, these expeditions nurtured the image of the king as a peaceful conqueror, ensuring the prosperity of his lands through openness to the world. Inscriptions and bas-reliefs on funerary monuments from the Second Dynasty sometimes indicate the return of these exotic cargoes, contributing not only to the material wealth of the kingdom, but also to its imagination. The presence of rare aromas in temples or precious woods in palaces illustrates the divine favor believed to have been bestowed upon Egypt. Thus, at the moment of entering a large-scale construction phase, the country could count on a considerable supply network, ranging from Nubia for gold to Levantine regions for wood, not forgetting the African potential represented by Punt for fragrances and animal curiosities.